Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Pendragon stream. And today we've got a slightly different approach to the question of castles because I imagine when I say to you, think of a castle, you probably have a great keep in your mind or a curtain wall with many towers, some sort of medieval fortification, maybe a Norman one, a Plantagenet one, probably an Edwardian one, one made by Edward I, something like that. And we think of these great sieges and battles with knights in armour and Robin Hood and his merry men doing daring escapades along the battlements. And this is traditionally how we think of a castle. Indeed, the word castle seems synonymous with many of these places. But the history of fortifications is much older than that and goes back not just centuries, but millennia before the emergence of these castles. And so today we're going to look at arguably Britain's earliest stone castles, or at least stone fortifications. And this is, of course, in the wonderful, magnificent Hadrian's Wall. And to help me do this, I have a number of fine gentlemen to help me with this cause. First, I'd like to introduce is a fellow member of the Pendragon Foundation. It is Rupert August. Hello, Rupert. How are you doing?
Hello, doing well. Thanks for inviting me onto this stream. It's a very good one, very good topic.
It's a real pleasure, Rupert. And I know some folks who have watched us before will know that we love to talk history and British history and how it fits into a broader whole. So that might give them a little bit of anticipation of what we're going to be doing tonight. Next, I would like to introduce a man who I think, in terms of history channels and discussions on Roman history in particular, has been fascinating for many of us to listen to, especially in his streams with Apostolic Majesty. It is Furious Pertinax. Hello, Furious. How are you doing, sir?
Hello, good evening. Lovely to be here. Thank you for the invite. Sadly, I haven't quite done the reading as I would have liked to have done to refresh on things, pertaining to, say, Hadrian and his rule. But I hope to have enough residual knowledge in the brain to be able to elucidate on a few points regarding the topic. But no, indeed, thank you for having me here and to be amongst such illustrious company. It's a pleasure.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. And speaking of illustrious company, we also are delighted to have Bede of Britannia. Hello, Bede. How are you doing tonight?
Hello, Nathan. Great to be on the stream for Pendragon. And I've streamed with Marcus before and Rupert August. So it's good to be amongst friends for this very important topic.
Thank you. And I think it is an important topic. And before we kind of get into the meat and bones of it, and before I play maybe a little advert for something, I think it might be worthwhile just saying our experiences of the wall, if we have any. And I will go first, because my experience of Hadrian's Wall, beyond just the classroom and learning about it at school, is when I was maybe about 10, my father took me and my sister to go camping next to Hadrian's Wall. Sadly, I don't remember which part of the wall. And I remember just being so enthusiastic and amazed at the remnants of these stone fortifications, which were, the best part of 2,000 years, and being able to actually walk among them and touch those stones was quite incredible. And thinking of that idea of being on the frontier, the edge of the civilized world, at least how it was presented in the kind of exhibitions and so on, and the wild north beyond, which my family is from Scotland, so it kind of also conjured up notions of being the wild barbarian in me. And I remember camping till for overnight next to the wall. There was a campsite, and waking up in the early hours, the cows mooing in the background, just looking up at the stars, and just thinking, wow, these stars are the same stars those Roman soldiers who stood on that wall gazed up at too. And those sounds of the cows are probably not too dissimilar from those that they heard as well. So it was quite a magical moment and way to experience Hadrian's Wall. Do you guys have any Any memories of Hadrian's Wall yourselves?
I've never been to it, sadly, as I live in the opposite end of the country. But it's always something you associate with Roman Britain. It's one of the most defining, I think, symbols of it. Really, because whenever you're young and you learn about it in school, it's always mentioned. And and I guess one always compares it to other famous fortifications on the front. Like the Great Wall of China. Obviously not as big, but for us, we're British. It's special to us. And also, just to, I think, put it in some wider context, what a lot of people may not realise is that with Hadrian's Wall, it's not, people just think, oh, the Romans built this great wall at the north of Britain. But the fact is, it forms part of a wider set of imperial defences. So they were known as the limes. So you had them on the Rhine in Germany, you had them on the Danube, and you even had them off in the Far East as well. And so the wall is just part of a sort of a great set of fortifications. So I just think that's an important wider context to bring up, because not that many people know that. You often just think of it as just one wall on its own. So
on that point, quickly, before we lose track of that, there's actually another set of fortifications in the UK, or even in England, that is forgotten about. And I think in some ways it's a lot more important. But the Saxon shore is replete with a set of fortifications which fulfill a similar function, except facing the sea instead of guarding a land border. So yeah, we have two of these like great Roman monuments, frontier defenses in England, but only one of them really gets remembered.
Oh, that's interesting. I thought you were going to say Offa's Dyke, because that's still a fortification, albeit it was built by the Saxons to guard off the Welsh in Mercia.
Yeah, that's a little bit later. Funnily enough, that's my neck of the woods, so that's what I'm a little bit more familiar with. The Scottish March is the wrong march for me. I'm on the Welsh one.
Sadly for me, no. Although I've been fortunate enough to visit Britain a couple times, I have not quite made it to Hadrian's Wall. In fact, I think I might have been talking to you, Nathan, when we did meet up at the event. I did have sort of plans to actually perhaps go from there, because I figured, well, from London, Birmingham's halfway towards the wall, but sadly with my truncated calendar, I didn't have the time to go north, sadly, so I have not a memory of Hadrian's Wall. But just on the point that these two gentlemen have raised, there's often I suppose the Saxon shore is somewhat less famous than Hadrian's Wall, but there's also another set of fortifications that also traverses the entire width of Britain, and it was built a little bit further north, the Antonine Wall. Although, so far as I'm concerned, I think very little, if any, of it actually remains. But it actually is indicative, and I suppose when we talk about the history of the reasons why and what for and how Hadrian's Wall came about, we'll probably talk about this, because more than one campaign was actually launched north of Hadrian's Wall, the most successful being that of Agricola, and his campaigns being recorded by his relative Tacitus. And so we have, although we still don't technically know where the Battle of Mons Grappius took place, we do know it took place in modern day Scotland, in Roman Caledonia, and so it is not the only one, but it was the largest one. The Romans held it for the longest time, and then once the Romans withdrew from Britain in 410 AD, those fortifications more or less remained intact. I mean, obviously parts of it have degraded over time, and stone has probably been taken by peasants and villagers and whatever. But as we are well aware, large parts of that wall and the series of fortifications, around it, the legionary force, etc., are existent for us to be able to see. And also, just to touch on Bede's part, his point about the limes. What's interesting is that it does pertain to a sort of a fortification process at that time, where Hadrian solidifies the borders. And in the east, it's almost impossible. If you look at a map, where do you build a wall between the Black Sea and the Arabian Sea, or the Red Sea rather? It's almost impossible. So that what they did is they fortified cities in the east, but obviously there were no great cities in the north of England. There wasn't like an Amida and Edessa, a Dura Europus, none of these sort of a Damascus, a large city to fortify that could be garrisoned by a large contingent and held by a large citizen militia. So instead, the Romans resorted to they sort of conceived of the idea, well, we have a relatively narrow width of a province of a landmass. We'll just build a wall and we'll keep the Picts out. and that sort of reflects two different policies that the Romans had, where they took a geography into account.
And just to add to that, Marcus, I think it's worth looking at Hadrian's predecessor, Trajan, because I think it's very interesting to look at the mindset of the Romans change between those two rulers. So obviously, this is the time of what would give them call the five good emperors. So you've got Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, who we've mentioned about the Antonine Wall, and then Marcus Aurelius. And so this is very much seen as like the peak of Roman civilization, this dynasty, somewhat. And under Trajan, obviously he's the last, I think, sort of great conquering emperor, because he adds 3 provinces. He adds Thracia, he then adds Mesopotamia and Armenia, and he then dies shortly afterwards. And then when Hadrian comes in, what does he do? He gives up 2 of these provinces. He abandons Mesopotamia and Armenia. And now why does he do this after only just having conquered them? And I think it's because he realized that as great as Trajan's campaigns may have been, he may have overextended the empire somewhat. And as you alluded to, Marcus, because of the geography, it's very hard to try and defend that territory with a great fortification. So I think him retreating was probably a sensible idea. And so it's then interesting looking at Hadrian. It's, these ideas come up if you read people like Spengler. There's this idea that civilization, when it's kind of in its youth and it's growing, it's all about energy and it's all about expansion. But then when you kind of get into like the autumn and winter periods, the civilization's all about like hibernating and hunkering up and withdrawing in, so to speak. So you almost see that Hadrian is like, I need to try and like preserve what we have rather than infinitely expanding. Right. Otherwise, I think we might lose the whole empire.
Well, you could see that with the example of Hadrian's Wall, right? In terms of Agricola expands northwards, as you said, has the Battle of Mons Graupius, somewhere in the highlands of Scotland against various tribes. But the fortifications established at that point include places like Edinburgh and on the west coast of Scotland. So they do have southern Scotland, or modern Scotland as it is today, under their control, but that's quite a hard territory to maintain. And so building Hadrian's Wall is a kind of taking a position where it's much easier to defend.
Indeed.
And not overexposing the Romans in Britain.
Exactly.
Well, my understanding is also that the Antonine Wall had the problem of putting too many people who were fairly hostile to Rome on the inside of the wall, whereas ideally on the outside. I suspect I've not really thought about it before, but I suspect a similar calculation may have been at play with Mesopotamia as well. Not just the fact that it's obviously a very expensive, very difficult place to fortify if you're trying to cover the entire eastern flank.
Indeed.
But even just how many people who are going to be amenable to whatever enemy is going to be invading you are going to be on the wrong side of the wall.
And the fact that Trajan dies so soon after, had Trajan lived another 20 or so years, and there'd been the ability to sort of solidify a civilian administration and a military occupation in those territories and take hold of those territories, so they could establish these routes, both civil and military, side by side, and improve the chances of the Romans holding territories. I mean, Trajan embarks on his campaigns and more or less dies on the way back to Rome from the Eastern campaign. It happens quite quickly. Just one thing I wanted to quickly mention, just you both, Rupert and B, just jolted my memory slightly before we get to the main meat and potatoes of the discussion, is that for those of you who are sort of wily-eyed might notice that this is probably the PFP I use most. And this is a picture of a fortification, obviously. But this, for those who don't know, this is actually from the I'm trying to think which gate it is. It is the easternmost gate of the Aurelian Wall, which opens into the Villa Borghese in modern-day Rome. And it's actually quite unfortunate that the two Roman fortifications we're quite well acquainted with, because I've spent time in these places, are the Theodosian walls in Istanbul. Because we sort of associate them with Eastern Empire, with the Byzantines and the Eastern Greeks, but they were technically built at like the real sort of twilight of the unified empire. They were built by Emperor Arcadius was a boy, but under the Praetorian prefect, whom his father had left in charge of the city's construction. I mean, you're talking still 5th century. This is pre-Justinian, So they're very much Roman walls in that sense. And then the Aurelian walls are built a century earlier under the obvious Emperor Aurelian. And Aurelian is only, he's within more or less a century of the life of Hadrian. There would have been people alive at Aurelian's time who would have had a living memory of Hadrian. And so the point I'm trying to convey is that in some ways, Hadrian's Wall provides a prototype for the larger fortification projects which the Romans engage upon following the year of the good emperors, as B's described. And as the Romans find themselves increasingly on the defensive, and there's a great necessity to construct fortifications, when they eventually realize that the old Severian wall around Rome is totally insufficient for its intended purpose, they then build the Aurelian walls. And these are much stronger fortifications, much more robust. They're taller, far more guard towers. They protect far more of the city, and they're a much better defensive mechanism, to the point where much of the Aurelian wall still stands in modern day Rome today, and the Severian walls essentially exist in tiny fragments between apartment-built blocks nowadays. And then again, you sort of go forward another century or so, you see the Theodosian walls. And for anyone who's traveled to Istanbul before, even though those walls took several batterings through the period of late antiquity and all through the Middle Ages up until the eventual siege of 1453, much of the Theodosian wall survives. And you kind of see trace elements. And this is actually one of the reasons I do want to go to Hadrian's Wall in person, obviously, but to sort of see this lineage from these embryonic ideas that the Romans established constructing Hadrian's Wall all the way to their, you might say, their magnum opus with the construction of the Theodosian walls. This might be a bit out of your purview, Nathan, but I know you enjoy fortifications, so maybe we can touch on it at the end, perhaps.
Absolutely. I think part of this is understanding not just Hadrian's Wall in its British context and the immediate Roman context, but actually the legacy of it and how that kind of develops and connects maybe to the castles that we do think of more broadly. Before we kind of get into things, I think this is a good point maybe to highlight something which is out there in the world right now, which you can buy to support Pendragon. And let me play a little advert for it. The Pendragon Foundation is all about rebuilding Britain's strongholds, and we have collaborated with the Corncrake magazine to produce this beautiful publication. Inside, you can hear about our vision for castles, how we want to transform them into centres of culture, community and commerce. You'll also be able to read plenty about the history of castles, stories about castles, poetry about castles, and see some beautiful art concerned with Britain's castles. If you would like to support our efforts in restoring Britain's strongholds, go to pendragon.foundation, where you can buy a copy today. And just to add to that, we also have a calendar, which is filled with plenty of beautiful paintings by artists like Turner and Constable. It celebrates traditional British dates in the calendar, Christian, pagan, and more broadly. And this too can be bought at pendragon.foundation. And if you get the magazine and the calendar together, you get one half price. So go over there now. We've already sold out our first run, so we're printing more. They're in hot demand. I'd recommend doing it. So I think maybe before we get into kind of the Roman history of Hadrian's Wall, might be worth saying a few words on why Hadrian's Wall is conserved at all. Because there was a point in its history where a lot of people, certainly around the 19th century, were taking bits of stone to reuse in their buildings. There was a long history of pillaging the wall, and especially when it had no practical use and there wasn't anyone particularly guarding it or protecting it. There was no institution set up to protect historic buildings at that time. This would come later in the 19th century. So there was a lot of vandalism of the wall, and it was getting degraded. In the 19th century, in the year about 1834, a man called John Clayton, who was the town clerk of Newcastle, decided to use some of his money to start buying up pieces of land upon which the wall and various forts were based. He had grown up close to the wall and was fascinated by its heritage and history, and was very enthusiastic about Roman history. He bought several of the forts, including Housesteads, Chester, and Vindolanda. And on these bits of land, there were farms that Clayton would use the revenue to help restore and reconstruct parts of the wall which had fallen into decay. And so he was able to save various stretches of the central part of Hadrian's Wall. He also was one of the pioneering figures in archaeology on Hadrian's Wall. And I think he collected something like 4,000 objects alongside his friend John Collingwood Bruce, who would go on to popularize Hadrian's Wall in the public imagination with his book, The Roman Wall, in 1851. And so what we see with Clayton is a man who uses the revenue he can produce from the land to save and secure the future of this historic monument. And I think from a Pendragon point of view, this fellow is very inspirational, not only for saving Hadrian's Wall, but the manner in which he did it. Because that's exactly what we want to do with castles. We want to generate income to secure and preserve them. But yes, I think that without Clayton's intervention, much of Hadrian's Wall would have been lost before something like the National Trust came along, before the Society of the Protection of Ancient Buildings, which are, towards the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. So we have a lot to thank Mr. Clayton, I think. Do you gentlemen have anything you want to contribute on this dynamic with Clayton?
Yes. What I find fascinating is though that 1834, that would have been just before Victoria came in, I think later through the 19th century, the Victorians have this interesting attitude towards the Romans and their legacy, especially in Britain. And because obviously at the time, it's the height of the British Empire, and a lot of them were thinking about Rome, had her rise and then her height and then her fall. And there seems to be this idea that Britain may go through the same cycle. And something I was actually reminded of that Elfemplar, formerly known as Cringe Walker, actually shared on X recently, was this post about Britain in the 19th century. There was like this genre of art of people like painting like future ruins of like London, like deep into the future, like after like Britain had like fallen into like an apocalypse or something, and these are the ruins people are going to find. And it just seemed like incredible, like, because at the time I think many Roman ruins in London were being found from that period, and so it was almost like history is almost like making peace with the historical process, the rise and fall of empires and civilizations. So it's like, we've mentioned there with conservation, it's like we need to conserve the past because our own society could be destroyed, and so we would want our own heritage to be remembered and conserved, so we'll do the same for the past.
I was just going to say that firstly, I was unaware of the story, so I find it quite heartening to have heard that, because I think one of the most important aspects of being able to preserve history, not only for our own benefit, but for those of those yet to come, for our successors who shall come after us, is having a fondness of, to use the Greek term oikos, of home. And it's not just the land itself, or it's not just necessarily the township, but it's, for example, it is something like Hadrian's Wall, or I suppose a bit complicated with the Theodosian walls because there's no Greeks anymore in Istanbul, but like the Theodosian Wall or something of that sort, which it's a great work that is constructed by a people, and even though the work itself might be technically redundant for its intended purpose, it still presents a magnificent display of technical and of technical engineering, of construction, of imagination, of in this case like an exertion of a display of military might, and in essence, and very much more in the case of Hadrian's Wall than the other two examples, the demarcation of a territory between sort of us and them, and having that appreciation, as you said, that first gentleman, he actually grew up nearby the wall and was fascinated by it. I think living in a society that sort of garners that kind of spirit and cherishes it, and provides the how can I call it, sort of the cultural and intellectual environment that fosters that, which is a very alien concept from those of us who live in our present age, I suppose, is so important. And the one thing I just wanted to remark as well is because I came across this doing some reading on one of my streams with Mr. Majesty, some time ago, and that is the prevalence of something they call the Grand Tour. And I don't mean the Amazon show with one Jeremy Clarkson, but the thing that it's named after, which is that sort of tour through continental Europe, primarily undertaken by sort of British aristocrats or the upper class of British society, and Italy being the main destination of the Grand Tour. And often it'd be sort of like a young man coming of age, and he'd either travel with a family member or a tutor, or they would rendezvous with someone in Italy, and they'll sort of traverse much of the country seeing old sites. And some of these tours went to other places. They went to Greece as well, and to southern France. And I wonder how much of that leading up to this time period may have had an influence, if not on the man directly, but maybe people around him who may have inspired his curiosity and his interest in Hadrian's Wall. Because I have a feeling that even if it's not directly related, I kind of have this feeling that from what I understand, because I'm sure each of you three are far more familiar with the Victorian period than myself, but this sort of how can I put like this sort of rejuvenation of an interest in classics, sort of you see in the Victorian era, and even leading into the Edwardian era, is sort of triggered by this in the same way that one might say that the Renaissance is a lead up to the Age of Enlightenment, so to speak. Not to be tried, but the Grand Tour is something of a lead up to this sort of rejuvenation of the sort of an appreciation, almost like a neoclassicism. Do you guys think there's anything to that?
Yeah, it's an interesting comparison that I would point to, if the Renaissance perhaps being to ideas what the Grand Tour is to sort of archaeology and physical artifacts. I mean,
you described it better than I did, Rupert. Thank you. That's what I was aiming for.
Yeah, well, clearly it's a little bit reductive, because there was obviously a great interest in the artifacts in the Renaissance as well. But it is interesting to link up these two ideas and yeah, mull if there's anything there.
Because as I'm sure each of us know, and definitely probably to our audience, like these things seldom exist in a vacuum. Like often, like something is a genesis of something else. Like something, not to get into a big history tangent, but so for example, like the Greek War of Independence sort of didn't start from nothing. It was a whole bunch of factors, Russian interference, a rise of national identity, and the Ottoman Empire crumbling down. Meanwhile, it had sponsors in the West, people like, say, Lord Byron, for instance, who were sort of inspired by and were greatly sort of intellectually motivated by the sort of this uncovering and rebirth of appreciation for the ancient Hellenes, for the ancient Greeks. I kind of feel there's a theme that runs there, particularly amongst the British, obviously.
Absolutely, and I think just before I come to this building, I think not just Clayton, but a number of men in the Northeast, such as the Duke of Northumberland during this period, started collecting items not from around the world. So various Dukes of Northumberland imported things from Japan, China, from North Africa, the Middle East, places they had been on service or on diplomatic missions, brought back these goods, but they also then turned to the native land as well, and were doing funding and leading archaeological excavations in Britain. So it very much fitted in with what they were experiencing abroad, and exploring, and then taking that attitude back with them. So I do see that there. And what's interesting too with Clayton is he and two fellows, Dobson and Granger, were critical to the rejuvenation of Newcastle city centre, and they were very much inspired by a neoclassical way of architecture. So here we could see one of the products of their inventiveness, their ingenuity, their enthusiasm, was the Theatre Royal, or the new Theatre Royal, as it was at that point. So we can see that for Clayton, preserving the Roman Hadrian's Wall isn't just an appreciation of history, but it actually manifests in the very architecture that he thinks will elevate the city which he lives in. So it has a kind of a practical output in how he's trying to transform his society. So I think that's quite a noteworthy thing about his engagement with the archaeology.
Absolutely. And I suppose I say this as a person who is, although not ethnically English or British, but definitely a child of the Commonwealth, is that, because I mean, I speak for myself here, but one of the things that absolutely got me interested in history as a boy, basically, was documentaries. And I mean, to this day, I still think that the British are unrivaled in their ability to create documentaries and even write tomes and novels pertaining to history. And there must be something in the British mindset that really orientates it towards the retelling of history, although one can probably appreciate that this side of maybe the 2010s, it's a little bit more foggy because of ideology and politics, but sort of things written, say, previous to 2010 or certainly previous to the 2000s, documentaries, even from the 70s and 80s, are still very high quality and are created and done by people who have an ardent love of essentially the science, I suppose, of archaeology, and sort of the intellectual pursuit of the subject writ large, but then also of a given period. Historians will specialize as medievalists or as classical historians, what have you. And I still, even today, I still find great joy in watching those sort of documentaries, and I sort of find that much more than the Americans or even continental Europeans, or not the Australians make many documentaries, but the British certainly excel at that. And there must be something in there must be a nugget in that intellectual zeitgeist created in that time that even sort of has inertia in the modern day.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Marcus, because obviously Nathan's just showed us the Theatre Royal there, and we've mentioned neoclassicism.
Indeed.
I can't help but I feel the Brits and the Americans, I think, when it comes to their classicism, are the most tasteful, like in terms of architecture. Like, I really like the
I'd
Theatre
agree with
Royal
that.
you've just shown there, Nathan, and also I quite like, some of the American ones, are quite good. But unfortunately, with neoclassicism, I find it's a bit hit and miss. I think there are some buildings which are a bit absurd, like you've got the Valhalla in Bavaria, because that was built by I think it was Ludwig I of Bavaria, and because he was obsessed with Greek civilization, and it's a great building, but it's like overly big and like it's a bit gaudy, and it's like, you called it Valhalla, like that's a pagan origin. Why are you mixing that with like something that's based on the Greeks? It's all a bit muddled.
Mixing the Nordic and the Mediterranean sort of mythos.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's an interesting thing there as well in terms of, and you've kind of just hinted at it, that so somebody like Clayton and Collingwood Bruce are fascinated by the Romans and going down a classical route and trying to preserve that aspect of their identity. But of course, figures like Ruskin and Gilbert Scott and William Morris are much more influenced by the medieval and really try to preserve a Gothic architecture. And that's also for various ideological reasons and seeing it as kind of an expression of the true of Christendom. And trying to vivify that in an industrial age. So on the one hand, and that's very much a kind of reaction against the industrial, whereas what you guys were kind of saying earlier was perhaps the turn to the Roman and the classical world was almost okay, we are in an imperial vogue now, and so embracing it. So I wonder if the kind of two architectures are themselves a kind of, whether or not somebody's kind of affirming the current imperial age or in some ways turning against it.
Yeah, funnily enough, I was just about to make a similar point, but yeah, I don't want to sound like too much of a postmodernist on this kind of stuff, but yeah, I do tend to think that either consciously or unconsciously there is often an ideological undercurrent to, or at least certain assumptions that are sort of going into it, but it can get very conscious sometimes. So to take an example of what you're sort of describing there, I think in the case of George III, this was very conscious because in the British context, he sort of oversaw, or during his reign, he oversaw some of the transition away from neoclassicism towards Gothic architecture again. And in his case, he was perhaps more cynical than most about it, because it was a turning away from kind of like classicism that had a few too many liberal connotations. And so due to the French Revolution and that sort of tainting certain liberal ideas and sort of everything associated with that, including classical architecture, despite George III's own neoclassical preference, he ended up sort of reluctantly going along with the Gothic revivalism, because again, that came to be associated more with aristocracy and tradition and medievalism and all that kind of just general not fully anti-enlightenment, but anti-liberal certainly, and anti-revolutionary.
So I think we should turn our attention now to the building and context of Hadrian's Wall. It's in some ways it's hard to find a starting point, because you could look at things even beyond the first invasions of Britain, but maybe as a starting point, it might just be worth going through some of the early history of Britain's relationship with the Roman Empire. And I suppose it begins with Julius Caesar. Would that be a fair starting point, guys?
Yes, well, that's the very first military campaign or expedition, if you like, to Britain from the Romans. I think me and Marcus, you discussed that, you and I discussed it on the stream on my channel a couple of years ago when we were actually talking about Caesar, and it's a bit of an interesting diversion from the Gallic campaign, but it doesn't quite go to plan, does it?
No, that's right. One thing that's probably worth saying, just as a lead up to that, I mean, I do presume that most of the people who are watching here, because it's more your history than mine, but to say that obviously the people who populated Britannia, prior to Roman invasion, were quite closely associated to the Gauls. You might say that was sort of a part of a broader sort of European Celtic group, which leading up to the sort of first century BC. Like at the beginning of that period. So the time of, say, Rome's foundation, like in the what's that 753? Gallic and Celtic culture, or Celtic culture rather specifically, stretches from the highlands, or the rather lowlands of Scotland, because it sort of depends if you categorize the Picts as them or not, or as something else. But Celtic culture stretches all the way from let's just say the Highlands, or at least the Southern Highlands, as far down along the west there as central Spain, hence what we call the Celtic Iberians, and even the modern day province of Galicia, which is on the northwest of Spain, who are named after the Gauls in essence. And then these people stretch as far eastwards into Europe as it's where the Czechs get the name Bohemia from the Boii tribe, who have their origins in what is sort of the western periphery of modern day Czechia, or Czech Republic, if you want to call it that. So this culture has a vast expanse, and so the people of Gaul and the people of Britain had very strong cultural ties, very strong religious ties, shared, I presume, something along the that you could describe as a mutually intelligible language, similar customs, similar appearance and sort of physiology. And so they would not have been that sort of, I mean, they would have had their distinctions. There would have been things that made them different, but they were, shall I say, they had a lot more in common with each other than, say, they would have had with, the Romans or the Greeks as a separate civilizational sphere. And so when the Romans arrive, when Julius Caesar comes knocking on the door, sailing his triremes and biremes from, the northern ports of France, it's quite the shock for the Brittonic tribes, who had never seen anything quite like the Romans before.
I'll just add into that the folks who lived in Britain at that time probably spoke some what would be called Brittonic, or their Celtic P language, and today the closest might be something like Welsh or
Mhm.
Breton,
Yep.
rather than English, which has its Germanic roots. And the north of Scotland. So an interesting distinction is it's often said in the literature that Lower Scotland would have been also part of this Brittonic culture, whereas perhaps Western and Northern Scotland
Mhm.
would share more of a similarity with Ireland in terms of its
Yeah.
language and people. So maybe that's also something to bear in mind when we think about the extent of Roman rule in Britain at
Mhm.
that time. It does seem to match on to those ethnic differences.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so so Caesar comes about 50, what was it, 54 BC first time, and then he tries
Mhm.
again in 55 BC.
Mhm.
And he does what does he establish in Britain in those invasions?
Well, what's interesting is the first landing, and sorry, I'm kind of going off memory here, but the first landing is, you could say, a debacle, but it's at the least almost a debacle, to the point where many of the Roman ships end up sort of crashing into the shoreline. Many of them drift off course entirely, and the legionnaires have no means of being able to disembark. Although eventually they do resort to um, sort of on the fly, almost knocking together what you'd almost consider dinghies, or like, little sort of like mini boats from spare wood that they have on board, which would have been used for siege engines. But the legions, as they attempt to disembark and drop from the ships, have, because one of the obvious strengths of the Romans is the formation fighting, and the fact that they're sort of, they're regimented and organized as they were, much like the Greeks, but in a different way. Or rather than ataxias and phalangites, you're talking about centuries and maniples and cohorts and what have you. Um, and not that these soldiers are particularly weak individual fighters, it's just not where they thrive. And the other thing is, if you have formation fighters who are scattered, and then they're fighting in, calf deep, knee deep, waist deep water, and you can't move properly, and you're laden with, the scutum and the galea, the Roman helmet, and all the armor and the peel of the javelins. Not the easiest way to wade upon a shoreline at the best of times, never mind with the howling winds of the English Channel and drizzling rain and all that sort of stuff. And you have, 10,000 woad painted Brittonic warriors on their chariots and throwing javelins at you from the cliff faces. So the Romans have a really hard time, and it's actually so fraught that one of the eagle bearers of the 10th Legion jumps off his ship and wades onto the shore with the eagle. And as for those who are familiar with the Roman history and Roman sort of military doctrine, the legions are absolutely, the eagle, the standard of your fighting, whether it's the individual cohort or the legion itself, is sacrosanct, and soldiers will literally die to protect them. And so the 10th is actually like the first legion that kind of gathers cohesion because they want to defend their eagle. And eventually Caesar, this is often said, Caesar being Caesar, starts to improvise by using, he manages to order some of the larger ships away from the shore and then uses smaller ships to ferry men on board. Meanwhile, they're actually evacuating wounded soldiers. A bit like a Gallipoli arrangement from World War One in many ways, just ferrying troops back and forward from the coast to the back to the ships. And the Romans eventually clamber and gain a bridgehead, because once the Romans are at least, either just out of the water or in fact on the beach, they're able to, create the battle lines, get into formation, find their units, and led by their centurions, they push onto land. And the sort of Brythonic method of fighting war is not sort of toe to toe in formation, armor clad, with melee weapons. The Brythonics are much more inclined, even less so than what the Gauls were, in sort of toe to toe slugfests. And they find that once the Romans are on the shore and are able to fight cohesively, that they just can't make an impression on the legions. They end up sort of pulling back inland. They see the beach of the Romans, but what they do is they harass the Romans constantly, And Caesar's at this point where he managed to build a legionary fort, managed to engage repairs on his ship, and sends out foraging parties. But then the problem is he doesn't have enough men on shore to defend his fort, but then also send out foraging parties and then protect the foragers. He's always got, not enough troops to do everything. And the Britons know this, so they just basically maintain their harassing tactics. Caesar does eventually get enough men on shore to sort of probe inland and gather intelligence and defeat a few ambushes, but he just simply hasn't prepared for this operation. So eventually sort of Caesar calls it quits. And then the invasion force in 55 the following year, in the following year, is, which would be 54 obviously because it's counting down, was much larger, had many more ships, more like supplies arrived with these ships as well. And the 55 campaign is actually rather different, whereas not to get too far ahead if you wanted to stop Nathan, but Caesar actually pushes inland. He actually burns the oppida of the trying to think of the tribe's name, I've just gone blank, but sort of they would occupy modern day sort of Kent and London, the Thames sort of estuary. I'm trying to think of what the Celt, anyway, I can't remember the name of the Brythonic tribe, but he ends up sort of burning the oppida, takes it, extracts tribute, and in fact I can't remember the tribe's name, but they were the largest tribe basically south of Caledonia, right? So they're essentially the dominant tribe of modern day southern England, and their chief rivals were the second biggest tribe. And so Caesar engages in, you might say, diplomacy and subterfuge, and ends up bribing the chieftain of the second biggest tribe to, in fact, raid the largest tribe in Britannia. And so he manages to sort of bring himself into the power plays of the island, and in fact gain intelligence and a sort of an affinity for his enemy that he's fighting, because Caesar's actually very skilled at this. But ultimately, again, he hasn't brought enough men for an actual occupation. He hasn't brought enough men to defeat all the British tribes in detail. And so there are people who suggest, and I probably put myself in this category, where if Caesar had the ability to, he probably would have conducted a third invasion. But by the time he retreats back to Europe with his forces, you already have the rumblings in Gaul. You have the massacre of the legion not far from modern day Paris, under the command of one of his subordinates, and his chief subordinate, Titus Labienus, barely escapes with his life, because he's also ambushed, but he managed to extricate his legion out from his winter quarters. And at this point, too, Vercingetorix is elected leader of what becomes the Gallic uprising, as the chief of the Averni. And so Caesar's obviously preoccupied with what begins as this sort of small smoldering ember of discontent and civil disobedience turns out into a full-blooded rebellion, and as we know, sort of plays out in the battles of Gergovia and eventually with the siege of Alesia, where you're talking, some estimates obviously very large in terms of the size of these battles, but you're still, between the Romans and the Gallic tribes, still talking overall numbers of at least 100,000. All said and done. So at that point, Caesar has absolutely no spare capacity to even contemplate another attack on England. So that's more or less what happens.
Yes, no, I'll just add into that the so that Caesar's own account of what happens, it tends to be the main primary source for the history of the invasions of Britain. But there's an interesting source that has been used, which is Geoffrey of Monmouth's The Kings of Britain. And this, at first glance, you're thinking, well, that's what, 1,000 years later? How can you use that as a source for this? But a number of historians have done some kind of source criticism on it. And although Geoffrey gets the names wrong of various things and kind of collides things together, when you start to understand how he's done that and how he's misunderstood things, it actually then points to various tribes within Britain who he's drawing on traditions from, and they offer like a third perspective, or because there's two of them, so there's the two perspectives you're getting in him from the Britain side of the Caesar's invasion. I would recommend Miles Russell's book, Arthur and the Kings of Britain, if you're really interested in that, because it really helps to flesh out the whole thing. And I think the thing that really jumps out is what Furious was mentioning, was that it's very easy to think of the Romans invading or a united Britain, a united series of Celtic tribes who were opposing a foreign invader. And that's really to impose, I think, a modern nation-state view of what's going on in this period, where you've got different groups, different tribes, different kin family, and although they share common culture and language and so on, they may hate each other more than they hate the Romans, and they will work with the Romans to overthrow their local rivals. I think of, like, in Scotland, the Celtic and Rangers supporters. I think they would ally with anyone who would help them to destroy the opposition fans, right? So I think, and we see this kind of pattern repeated in other historical contexts, like the conquistadors in South America. Many of the groups were quite happy for them to come in and overthrow the Aztecs. So I think this is something that we need to bear in mind as we move forward with this conversation.
Just as a side point, it might have come across as babble, because like I said, I really didn't have much of a chance to prepare for the stream. I just checked it. Yeah, so the main tribe whom I was describing that sort of occupied the periphery of sort of what is one day London and the Thames sort of valley were the Catuvellauni, and their tribe, their warlord, their leader was Cassivellaunus, and the man whom Caesar turned against him was Mandubracius, who was the tribal leader of the Trinavates. So, yeah, there was obviously Caesar playing politics with those men who, obviously, as the leaders of the largest and second largest tribe of what is more or less Monday England, he was already well attuned to that point. I suppose being a Roman politician, being an ex-consul and having played the power game in Rome, was more than adept at understanding the lay of the land, and use this to his advantage, because the tribal lands of the Trinovantes ends up coinciding with where the Romans eventually built their first fortress, which is what the Romans call Camulodunum, which is modern day Colchester.
I've actually been to the Roman fortifications at Colchester. That was many years ago when I was on the school trip. So it's actually one of the few Roman fortifications in this country I actually have visited and have some familiarity with.
So I think with that kind of beginning point, we have the initial kind of invasion and establishment of something in the south of Britain, but it's not extensive, and it's not a domination of a large area yet. There are some attempts are kind of muted in the intervening years with the next invasion. So in particular, in 40 AD, Emperor Caligula has several thousand men. I think it's 200,000 men are reported to be kind of marshaled in the northwest of France. But rather than go across, they collect seashells, which I think just sounds like a Caligulan sort of thing. Maybe I'm being very unfair to the emperor there.
I don't know if you watched Claudius, Nathan, but there's a great scene where he comes back from his so-called British campaign, where he says, "I have smote Neptune, here is the bounty of my victory," and the soldiers just throw the shells all on the floor, and it's just so comically absurd. It's wonderful.
But I believe it was to show he had conquered the sea, right? The English Channel or something like that.
Well, because he encountered so many sort of, I think there was like flooding or like bad weather. He blamed Neptune and believed Neptune was like trying to impede his invasion.
I see. Well, he did not get into Britain with his 200,000 men, but in 43 AD, Claudius launches a full-scale attempt to invade a large part of Britain. So what takes place during that invasion, gentlemen?
I actually have to say, I have to admit, because it's kind of a bit out of my purview, I'm not particularly familiar with the actual campaign of conquest that is undertaken by Claudius, because I'm more familiar with the Iceni rebellion and the battle with Boudica, and the disaster of I suppose you guys call it the Battle of Watling Street. It's never the best idea to attack a Roman legion uphill, but I mean, this campaign, to my knowledge, was, I'm trying to think of the actual general now. Was it Aulus Paulus? I can't actually remember. But
Paulus was the general that Nero sent to crush Boudica's rebellion, but he wasn't the.
Oh, that's right. No, that wasn't Paulus. That's right. You're quite right. Yeah, no, I've just got.
I think it's Aulus Is it Plautius? Is that right? I think that's how you say his name. He was sent by Claudius to kind of conduct this, and as far as I understand, they basically held by 47 AD the southeast of England, so up to Fossway or Fosseway, I guess, would be where it is. So I'll see if I can find a map of that, because that'll give us a sense. But
you're right. It is Aulus Plautius. Yeah, quite right. Yeah, you just jig my memory. It was Aulus Plautius.
There's an interesting through line with all of these cases as well, that my understanding of it, at least, is that basically every invasion of Britain has a significant element of almost like myth making. It's doing it purely because it is something that is because Britain, especially before the period of the invasions, before Caesar's first invasion, it's somewhere that there's a bit of debate in Rome as to whether it even exists, because the stories told about it seem so outrageous about how much of a land of savagery it is and all that kind of thing. So once Caesar has done it once, other people have to try and essentially one-up him. So in order to be able to match the Roman achievement of operating so far out at the peripheries and conquering a land of myth, basically, first Caligula and then Claudius have to try and do that to essentially prove their legitimacy and prove that they're the equal of Caesar's achievements, even though there's a very debatable utility to actually going there from the Roman perspective. But
what's interesting with Claudius, so just to mention other generals, I've actually got my copy of the Ecclesiastical History here by Bede, and Bede actually mentions that Vespasian was sent to Britain as well. So obviously that's the future emperor who would take over after the Year of the Four Emperors. But also, it's also interesting because after his conquest or initial conquest, what does Claudius do to legitimate himself? Well, he names his son Britannicus after Britain to really sort of cement his legacy ultimately.
Correct. That's right. Yeah, much in the same way that Germanicus was named following the. I suppose in the end, the Romans never actually ends up conquering Germania, but yeah, Germanicus was sort of named in much the same way. So it's worth keeping in mind that the Romans invade in 47 AD, and Caratacus, I can't actually remember what tribe he led, but he fought the Romans at the Battle of Medway, and ended up being the leader of essentially the resistance until his eventual defeat in 51 AD. And it's worth keeping in mind that the rebellion of the Iceni under Boudica is only eventually suppressed and defeated in totality in AD 61. So you're talking essentially a sort of 25-year period in which it takes the Romans to actually initially invade, certainly southern Britain, southern England, occupy more or less with this red line, is because the Romans don't complete the conquest of Wales until I think like 77 or 78 AD, and then Gnaeus Agricola eventually pushes further northward. But this southern part of England, it takes 25 years to pacify, more or less.
I don't know how well substantiated it is, but I think there's actually a theory around the rebellion of the Iceni in particular, that it was essentially orchestrated by a cabal, or like a conspiracy of Anglesey druids, because Anglesey was only finally conquered and subdued like a few years before, possibly almost contemporaneous with the outbreak of the rebellion. So obviously you have the slights upon Boudica herself that that formed some form of casus belli, but supposedly they'd been essentially orchestrating a kind of uprising and trying to organize some kind of rebellion for a long time, and then finally they pulled the trigger when the Romans came and actually made a play for Anglesey, which was obviously a site of extreme religious importance in the Brythonic Druidic faith.
Because I was going to say that's not Mona, is it? Or is that a different location?
I think it might be, actually, yeah.
Because I know the Romans do destroy it, like, purposefully so.
Yeah. So on the map that we're looking at the moment, it's the northwesternmost island of Wales. Yeah.
Sorry, what were you going to say, Bede?
What I was going to say is one of the reasons the rebellion is so initially successful and they're able to sack Colchester or Camulodunum is because we mentioned Suetonius and Paulinus, who defeats Boudicca. Well, he's actually the general who is sieging and trying to conquer Anglesey, and because it's the only army in Britain, it's bogged down trying to complete this conquest of this part of Wales, and it can't react to Boudicca because he's bogged down. So there's that element as well.
Yeah. And this is the thing: is the forces that Boudicca and the rebellion do defeat are basically a pair of Roman detachments that are sent piecemeal against her, which are insufficient to combat her numbers. But when they eventually face an entire legion, it ends up being a different outcome. Under different circumstances, they ought to have probably defeated a single legion on its own, but everything sent before them up to that point was very much piecemeal. They merely thought, oh, it's a rebellion, we'll just sort of, we'll send a cohort or two cohorts and suppress the revolt. But at this point, Boudicca had obviously amassed a very substantial fighting force, even if it was largely unprofessional, and even if it was supported by just sort of essentially men and their tools, or basic peasants with weapons. A fighting force is still a fighting force, especially when they're highly motivated, as the Iceni were, and their allies, of course.
Well, ultimately, I think Paulinus made a good choice of a Watling Street because it was a choke point, so the Celts could not use their superior numbers to overwhelm the Romans, and it ended up being a bit of a slaughterhouse.
Well, with the exception of rainfall, it's almost of like a pre-Agincourt in a sense. Up a hill, flanked by trees. There's actually some similarity if you think about it.
So after the kind of rebellion is defeated, and what date did you say that was, Furious? Was that
the Iceni, the defeat of the Iceni?
Yes.
60 or 61.
61, right. And then
61, yeah.
So
yeah,
then
61, yeah.
From 77 to 84, you get Agricola comes into play, and he really pushes northward. So he doesn't just retain what's been won here. He moves into Wales and then up into north of England, into Scotland, and actually has into the Highlands as well, where they fight the Caledoni or Caledonians and win a decisive victory against them. And this seems to be the kind of extent of his reach. But the question I guess I have is, given what you've just said, is okay, he won all of these battles against the various tribes as he made his way up, and they established various forts. But how well, how much was actually under their control at this point compared to, okay, they defeated various people, but were they actually ruling over them, or were they subjugated?
Yeah, I have to say. Oh, sorry, go Bede. I'll go after you.
Well, I think it's important to remember that the battle in particular you've alluded to, Nathan, the Battle of Mons Graupius, that is the, correct me if I'm wrong, Marcus, but I believe that's the most northern battle the Romans ever fought in their whole history.
Yes,
and yeah, yes, obviously you're going right. Carry on.
And I was just going to say, and the interesting thing is, if you have, if any of you have, say, like the Penguins Historical Atlas, because they've got one for ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and they've got other ones as well, is that when you see the sort of the line through Scotland, or modern day Scotland, where they suggest Agricola campaign through Scotland, And it sometimes happen with battles. We don't often geographically know exactly where a battle took place. I mean, like for instance, we have a very good idea where the Battle of Cannae took place. We know where we know where Arausio was, and we know where Coronea was, or Pydna. Like we have a good idea with many of these ancient battles that took place, but the Battle of Mons Grappius is actually quite an unknown location, and it's kind of interesting when you sort of see like the symbol that displays battle, which is like 2 cross swords. There's like 6 locations which could be possible places where Mons Grappius could have happened, because we just don't know where it actually took place. But you are correct. Wherever it did in fact take place was the northernmost pitched battle the Romans ever fought. So, yeah, well, there it says in the description, Battle of Mons Grappius, location uncertain. Yeah.
So it was somewhere generically the very north, quite north of Scotland, and I think although there was serious kind of establishment of fortifications and so on, we see a number of kind of uprisings that need to be dealt with. So in 105, a number of tribes take hostages over the into the north of England and need to be put down, and the same in 117 AD. That there's actually an uprising at that point too, and so that's the context in which Hadrian then in 122 AD decides to build or establish a wall on the northern frontier of Britain.
Well, just something I want to add before we get to there. Just one last point about Mons Graupius. We've mentioned Tacitus, who wrote the biography of Agricola, but there's this very famous speech Tacitus puts into the mouth of Calchas, the leader of the Caledoni, and at the very end, there's this very famous line which says, "You Romans, you make a desert and call it peace." And so, you need to have a bit of skepticism, because it's believed that when he then did that speech, Tacitus was kind of launching a veiled attack against the Emperor Domitian, who was the emperor at the time of Agricola's campaigns, and so there's that element.
The second son of Vespasian, just by the way. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And so again, it's almost like he's indirectly attacking the policy of the Romans towards Britain. It's like you're being far too harsh. You probably need to try and win some hearts and minds here.
Because it is actually worth noting that in the sort of the approximately, just before we move on, because I always miss the chance to mention it, that the force assembled to conquer Britain under Plautius is actually quite substantial. Because let's take into account that Caesar attempts the crossing initially with 2 legions, and then the force that he takes over the second time is at least twice as big, if not possibly larger. Could be as many as 5 legions, and unlike his first campaign, he actually takes over cavalry, because he doesn't have cavalry or much more than a small bodyguard unit. The first campaign, he actually goes over with 2,000 cavalry and many more supply ships. So the Romans have obviously learnt this lesson. So when Claudius orders Plautius over, it's the Second Augusta, which is actually technically the only one actually attested to, but the other legions that are suggested to have been taken over at the same time were 9 Hispania, 14 Gemina, 20th Martia Victrix, and they do believe that there could have been another legion sent over as well. So it's basically an equal force in essence to the one that Caesar took in his second campaign, but obviously, unlike Caesar, there was not the distraction of a Gallic uprising, and perhaps the situation in Britannia was different. Maybe the local tribes were weaker. Maybe the Romans had engaged in more subterfuge. We don't necessarily know the circumstances on the ground, but obviously this invasion force undertaken during the reign of Claudius by Plautius was far more successful. And after the initial conquest and then the suppression of the Iceni rebellion, there's 3 legions that are sort of maintained in Britannia, but then with the onset of the crisis of the first century, it's reduced down to 2 legions, and that's sort of more or less the force that's maintained in Britannia up until the evacuation. Well, they lose the legion north of the wall, quite famously, but then from that point onwards, only 2 legions are stationed there up until their withdrawal in 410. Just as a point of reference.
And also, you mentioned the crisis there, Marcus, but I can't remember his name, but there's a point where the empire breaks into 3. You've got the Gallic Empire in the west and the Palmyrene Empire in the east. Yeah, that's a Tetricus, because not only does he have Gaul, he also claims Britain as well. So there's a point where Britain is like...
And Hispania, yeah.
So the 3 western provinces are like a renegade empire in the making, if not for Aurelian.
Exactly. Which is quite a big power base if you think about it.
No, certainly.
Yeah, it would have been quite a hard area to maintain control over in that respect.
Indeed.
But kind of going back a little bit to then Hadrian's Wall, because I should have said when I mentioned these uprisings, they were in the south of Scotland. That was the region where they were taking place, and various forts in that region, such as at Newstead, were attacked, burned. There's evidence of bodies which were slashed there and so on. So these areas were getting serious revolts taking place during that intervening period. And then Hadrian, decides we're going to build a wall across from Newcastle to Bowness on Solway. So that is from the very east to the west. The whole landmass is covered there, about 72 miles in total. And the way that the fortification works is that the eastern, I would say it's 3/5 of it from the east along were initially stone, with the other 2/5 in the west being earthwork and timber, although later that would be made into a stone construction too. The wall itself would have stood, the curtain wall that is, would have stood maybe 5 to 6 meters high at any point, but it wouldn't have been super wide. We're talking maybe 2.3 to 2.9 meters in width for men to stand on. So this isn't something which is, like a giant castle battlement. It's not like Helm's Deep or Minas Tirith or something like that. It's a curtain wall, and come in, Furious.
No. I was just concurring with you. No, exactly. No, you're quite right.
And
rather than part of fortification, it's a different thing.
Yeah, because where the kind of garrisons are going to be distributed, where you have your main forts, places like Vindolanda, which are really like miniature towns at this point. They can host 600 men. They've got barracks, they've got family quarters, they have shops and smithies and places of worship, places of trade. Sorry?
And quite famously, bathhouses as well.
Bathhouses, yes. And so you really are having a center, not just for defensive purposes, but it becomes an economic and cultural center in the whole area, which,
Absolutely.
Given Northern Britain didn't have these at this time, these kind of big points of meeting, this was an important kind of development. But then you have the mile castles, which are how many is there? There's 80 mile castles along Hadrian's Wall, and that's a Roman mile. And these would have housed between 12 and 20 men. And they're about, again, 6 meters high off the ground. In between, and they would have been at each of the gates through the wall. So if you wanted to get across, it's not just a defensive thing there, but you've got a group of soldiers who are guarding that position, and there may have been customs and so on that would go on, various taxes that you must pay to transport goods either side.
Yeah,
and
I believe actually
go ahead,
just quickly. I believe the wall itself actually did bisect one of the lands of one of the tribes in particular. So presumably, especially on that customs and tolls angle, does make me wonder if that was deliberate to be able to raise more money from these groups who would presumably have to go back and forth for a reasonable amount.
It's interesting too that I think it's the Brigantes tribe, which were the ones that revolted prior to Hadrian's Wall. So it's cutting off their network in half.
That geography makes sense if it was the Brigantes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
just sorry, go Rupert. I'll come after you.
Just briefly, I mean that also probably has tactical considerations as well, or perhaps even strategic considerations. I'm not entirely. I'm not seeing it discussed elsewhere. I'm just trying to mull it over in my own head. But the idea that you'd have people on both sides of your wall who you'd hope that they're friendly, but perhaps that could act as some kind of rallying point, I suppose, where if you were facing a concerted attack from the north, then all of the people in your rear who are potentially facing their kin are hurting by being a speed bump basically to the main wall itself, potentially rallies your hinterland a little bit.
The other thing I was going to mention too is that, and it's not of that great consequence, particular discussion, just because point of interest, is that Britannia for basically the first half of existence as a province is a drain on the empire. The province actually never repays itself in terms of its overall sort of gross value. But Britannia, in the aftermath and the economic recovery that followed the crisis of the 3rd century, actually becomes a profitable province, both in terms of tax revenues and trade collection via these, via the wall and also through seaports, because they would have traded with the people of Hibernia, which is the name the Romans give to Ireland. The Hibernians are the Irish, more or less. It actually starts becoming a province which is profitable, which in some ways, if you think about the fact that Rome was sacked prior to the eventual sort of fall of the Western city, sort of in the mid-5th century, you can't help but think, with the sack by first of the Vandals from North Africa, and then by the
Visigoths.
Visigoths, thank you. I just went blank. Yeah, the Visigoths. Why did the Romans keep 2 legions on an island all the way up until 410, when really Rome was quite desperate for manpower and for cohesive fighting units on the continent? And that is actually because by that time period, this sort of post-Constantinian period, because let's not forget, there's a statue of Constantine in York, at Eboracum. Constantine is crowned there after his father dies, who's one of the tetrarchs, Flavius Constantius. Britannia is a major centre. It's a significant part of the Roman Empire. It's not as significant as Hispania maybe, and not as wealthy as what Gaul had become. But Britannia, say compared to maybe Pannonia or Raetia or some more desolate parts of Africa, Britannia was a profitable province and a largely stable one by the sort of the 3rd century. And so hence why they kept legions there up until such a late time. Just an interesting point.
Well, just to add to that, Marcus, but the first sack of Rome around that fall in 410, that's the same year they actually abandoned Britain. So that happened in the same year.
Exactly, yeah. It's in response to the sacking, exactly. And it's only and that is the only trigger essentially for it, is that it's so grave that the Romans feel they have no choice but to withdraw the legions.
Just before we move forward with the kind of history intervening that period, I think it's worth saying that the other fortification surrounding Hadrian's Wall was actually behind it, called the Vallum, and this was a ditch, a really deep ditch that goes all the way along Hadrian's Wall. So you could see it both and both ways. It's an extra line of defense if somebody manages to get over, but it's also if somebody's coming from your south. So what you were kind of saying, Rupert, about you've got enemies on both sides. Well, there is a level of defense on the interior of Hadrian's Wall as well that would give them some level of protection. But I also think it's the network, right? Because it's not just 1 or 2 castles. You've got 80-mile castles, and then in between them, you have turrets every third of a Roman mile. So the network of men. I think estimates suggest it would have taken 10,000 soldiers and plus auxiliaries to man this. But if you were able to do that, you would have a very quick response time to any trouble along the wall. I guess the challenge that many of the later Roman administrations faced was actually keeping up that level of maintenance, because that is a huge number of men to guard the border there.
Plus, probably more than you'd ever really need for that frontier, one would think. But yeah, I mean, it is worth bearing in mind that despite what we said about the unremarkable quality of the actual curtain wall itself, the actual teeth of the castle, the more important bits, or the wall itself, rather, Hadrian's Wall, is those towers and the fortifications along each mile. So, in that sense, you're getting quite a lot more than it might first appear just by paying attention to the wall, and that sort of qualifies it as a a much more of a cohesive defensive structure, as opposed to just a series of forts that are connected by a wall.
Well, essentially, when turrets and towers are that close together, they almost act as signal posts for one another. Not quite in that Napoleonic style where they have like the movable letter system that they had, but the Byzantines actually in Anatolia, when once they lost Syria and Egypt to the Arabs and they sort of pulled behind the Taurus Mountains, the East Romans had a sort of similar system where they had essentially there would have been a combination of an observation turret, but also as a fortified tower, and they had, I believe, two or three dozen of these, all the way from the bottom of the Taurus Mountains all the way to opposite the sea, Constantinople, which would have either been Scutari or Chalcedon. And once they saw an Arab force, they sort of light one tower, and eventually, by the time each tower sees the next one, that message would travel to Constantinople far quicker than a rider would. And in a sense, those towers being dotted along Hadrian's Wall would have acted in a similar system. I don't know if they had lights; they probably didn't. But if one of those or two of those turrets were assailed, its neighboring towers would hear that and would be able to respond to it, and then the ones next to them would hear, and so on. Which is the point of having relatively closely connected fortifications, is they're not too isolated from one another. But just a quick point, because we obviously just touched on the economy just before about trade and the cost of the province. Just in terms of from a position of grand strategy here, let's keep in mind that 10,000 men obviously presents a relatively significant fighting force, but once the main upset in Britannia is over, for the most part, the legions, I mean, there would have been legionnaires stationed probably in the main forts behind the wall, but for the most part, the wall would have been, in fact, guarded by auxiliaries. But even that said, if we consider that the fortification would have required 10,000 men to aptly guard and maintain the wall for its intended purpose of defense, and also as border protection, to not to use a modern terminology, but the customs and the tollways and the gatehouses, all that sort of stuff. The Roman army prior to the era of the Tetrarchy, so this post-Augustan army, because the army that Augustus inherits after the Civil War is huge. I mean, basically he disbands 2/3 of all soldiers that are under arms between the dispute between him and Mark Antony, and then between those two and the so-called liberators under Cassius Longinus and Brutus, and then eventually after Octavian or Augustus and Mark Antony had their climactic battle Actium, there are like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Roman soldiers. So the Roman army sort of ends up being trimmed down to, from the time of the end of Augustus up until the period of Aurelian, the Roman army oscillates between roughly 29 to 34, 35 legions. So you're talking a fighting force of anywhere from 250 to 300,000 men. in the period of the Tetrarchy and following from Diocletian onwards, and when they reconstitute the army, they actually split these forces apart. They have the Limitani on the frontier and then the Comitatensis as an interior inland field armies. This army is essentially doubled in size. So it goes from 250 to 500 or from 300 to 600,000. The point I'm trying to raise is that with these 10,000 men on Hadrian's Wall, you're talking 5% of the Roman force prior to with the old system, and then once in the post Diocletian era, so say from Constantine onwards, 10,000 men in fact constitutes like barely 2% of the size of the Roman army. So I'm not saying that it's insignificant or not insignificant. I'm just trying to bring into numerical proportion how much that would have sapped Roman strength to safeguard that frontier, just like for the sake of quantity.
I think that's very helpful, and with that, I think there's a further development here, because 20 years later, with a new emperor, we get the Antonine Wall being built, and this is, as you can see, much further north, really cutting Scotland in two here, from what is modern-day Edinburgh, and there are the remains of a large fort in Cramond in Edinburgh, over to the west coast, and the Clyde being the guide there. So kind of the Edinburgh to Glasgow and a bit further west. It's a much shorter wall, as you can see by comparison, and it was primarily an earthwork and palisade construction. I don't think there's been any stone. Certainly, the curtain wall was not stone at this point. But as a consequence of that, a lot of troops were removed from Hadrian's Wall and positioned on the Antonine Wall, leaving Hadrian's Wall to be somewhat left in disrepair. The main forts were still being used to some extent, but certainly like turrets and mile castles went into disrepair, and it seems that a number of lots of the masonry was being taken away by whoever, whether it be Roman legionaries to repair the forts they were living in, or the locals, the native tribes were taking from the wall as well. So that's already within a short period, it had been seen as replaced, and was falling into a bit of ruin at that point. And it's only it's later, when the Antonine Wall only lasts 20 years before that is itself abandoned in 162 AD, and there's a return to Hadrian's Wall and an attempt to repair several of these turrets and mile castles at that point. So there's a restoration work 40 years later following its construction.
Just to add to that, the Antonine Wall would later be reoccupied by Septimius Severus at the very tail end of the 2nd century, and he would attempt to refortify and rebuild it, but of course that doesn't last forever, and they end up returning back to Hadrian's Wall. So it's just interesting. It's almost like the Romans are trying to create like a layered defense here. The Antonine Wall is going to be our front line, but Hadrian's Wall is going to kind of be like our reserve defense. I wonder what, Marcus, your take on that is, because obviously if you look at the walls of Constantinople, you've got the original Constantine Wall, then it's the Theodosian walls, and then not the Anastasian walls. So there seems to be some sort of like layered defenses going on here.
Exactly. And from my understanding, I think the original walls of the Acropolis, of old Byzantium, before Constantine, creates his new city, his Nova Roma, if I am not mistaken, because it's totally for wall now, but if you travel to Istanbul, you'll actually see that the perimeter of the Topkapi Palace, which more or less replaced the Great Palace of Constantinople, the very sort of tip of that peninsula, much of that original wall of Byzantium was used as the fortification for what would become like the great palatial grounds of sort of Constantine's new city. So you sort of have the absolute innermost defenses of the of the forum, the palace, And then, like you say, there's a Constantinian wall which survives for some time, although I do believe by the Middle Ages it's almost been repurposed, shall I say. And then there is that Theodosian wall, which itself is a 3-layered fortification, and it takes the Ottomans an almost 20-to-1 advantage with artillery to overcome them. And then the Anastasian wall, which is actually a bit like Hadrian's wall and the Antonine wall, less a city fortification and more of like a geographical fortification, sort of not to be crude, but use it with more like strategic operational level. But that Anastasian wall is not used for much more than the period of Anastasius himself and a little bit afterwards. That is very soon abandoned, which is, it's hard to understand actually why, because it actually would have served the good purpose of defend the hinterland of the city. But I get the point you're making. It's this whole like idea of layered defense. And I think given what I mentioned before about the ratio of Roman troops, which would be required to have manned the wall at any given time, and as much as it is a relative drop in the ocean compared to total Roman fighting strength, particularly post Tetrarchy and with the new expanded army under Diocletian and Constantine, the Eastern Empire obviously had less resources, and so the idea of being able to occupy like a strategic, continuous, geographical fortification was out of the reach of the East Romans. If the unified Roman Empire found it difficult to maintain Hadrian's wall, then the East Romans would have had obviously more trouble. Just an interesting comparison, but glad you mentioned it, Bede. It's an interesting, side note, interesting tangent. Okay, just before we continue, Nathan, if I may, just because old mate Iron Dukes just commented on something quite good. I always like his input on things, particularly when I make a mistake. I always rely on Iron Duke to point something out. But here he says, modern military historians of ancient Rome, such as Adrian Goldsworthy, who I actually like, one of the very few good modern historians, think that the Romans used the wall as a base to control the surrounding area with cavalry and infantry patrols. And I actually agree with him, because I think that to a point explains the existence of these sort of fort-like locations placed along the wall, which obviously would have been used to house troops. But then, why do you need to house the number of troops? I mean, yes, obviously to maintain and man the wall, but a wall is only so good as the sort of quote-unquote intel that force has of what surrounds that fortification. And I completely agree with the idea that at the very least, cavalry, if not also infantry patrols, certainly infantry patrols within the walls, but probably cavalry beyond the walls, would have been utilized. And this also probably explains to the possibility of the Romans suffering casualties north of the wall, that maybe they got tied into, you might say, like a reconnaissance in strength, and some kind of skirmish took place, and that's the reason they lost soldiers north of the wall. But neither here nor there.
Well, it also means that they can keep an active role in politics north of the wall as well, which would also be quite important. So in the same way as, like, right at the start of all this, they were, siding with one faction against the other in order to, try to advance their own position. Once they're more settled, then they need to maintain the balance of power and try to, potentially keep rivals fragmented and all that kind of thing, because you can kind of nip a problem in the bud before it really becomes existential. Not only that, but I think it also, I should say I'm partial to this explanation as well, and I think it helps to also explain, looking forwards, what happens after the central Roman government weakens, let's say, especially on the Limes Germanicus. And we'll kind of get to the extent to which that might have happened with Hadrian's Wall as well, where the military outposts that represent these frontier forts are central organizational nodes after the fall of the central authority in the West. And so I think it sort of makes sense that they basically continue to do what they've always done, but perhaps the areas in which they try to administer and patrol grow substantially in size to fill the vacuum that's been left.
I think it's worth saying before we get to that point, and we should come to that soon, is the wall was breached several times, at least in a short period of time. So in 180 AD, there seems to be a massive a breach in the wall. It seems that one of the Highland clans, as they were being described, the tribes, the Caledoni, came down and overran Hadrian's wall in some way. We're not told exactly how much that is the case, just that it was the most serious war in Commodus's reign. That's what the historian says, the Roman historian said of that conflict. And there's certainly along Hadrian's wall, there's evidence of like serious burning and damage from that period. There's another example in 207 where the Metae or Metai attack Hadrian's wall and again overrun it, start looting, taking slaves, destroying small settlements. And that's the context in which Severus enters Britain with his legions and takes on the troops up to the north again in 208 and 209 AD, and reforms the Antonine Wall. So there is it's not as if once Hadrian's Wall and once the Antonine Wall are in place, that's it. The wall is impregnable, because it can seem that way when we describe it, 6 meters high with all of these troops along it and multiple turrets and mar castles. Well, actually, it was breachable, and it was breached several times within 100 years of its construction. And same with the Antonine Wall as well. So these were much more porous and possible to attack than it might first seem. Of course, the greatest example of this was probably in 367 AD. And I know I'm jumping forwards here, but this kind of will help bring us towards what you were talking about, Rupert, because this is what's called the Great Barbarian Conspiracy. At this point, it wasn't just raids from the north, but actually you're starting to get raids from Irish tribes like the Scotii, who will become the Scottish in due course when they settle in modern day Scotland. You have Germanic raiders coming into Saxons, Angles, Jutes, and I suppose, Rupert, that's where the kind of what you were talking about, the castles along the forts along the coast are being built in response to that.
Yeah, funnily enough, there's two theories on that. Either they are named after what they're defending against, or they're named after who inhabits them. So it's also possible that it was essentially Saxon mercenaries who were being housed in or being used to garrison the forts along the coast, both in Normandy and in southeastern England.
I mean, this would correspond with other developments in Roman Britain at that time, because it seems that beyond Hadrian's Wall there was a tribe called the Votadini, and they were basically foederati. At this point, they were basically hired to be a buffer along the Roman frontier between Hadrian's Wall and other tribes defending it. And I know that's a policy that was pursued along the Rhine with the Germanic tribes, but this didn't really work in 367 AD because a huge confederation of tribes from the north of Scotland, the Irish tribes, the Saxon tribes, and possibly the Votadini, all teamed together and poured over Hadrian's Wall and around it, and spent the year pillaging, looting, taking slaves, destroying towns. And really, it was without riposte, because the Roman soldiers at that point on Hadrian's Wall were not getting their pay. There was a pay issue, and so many of them joined in the pillaging of Britain. And so it was only later in the year, or the next year, that it was finally put down. But it was a serious kind of. I think they got down to the south of England. Like, it wasn't just contained in the north. This was a full-on mass, and it wasn't a revolt as such. It was more just. It seems like it was more just. If I were to use a modern example, when you look at like a riot or emerging from a protest, it doesn't tend to actually be kind of action designed to overthrow government. It's let's steal as many TVs as we can and let's destroy as much as we can rather than anything else. And it seems like that was the approach of these tribes. But this was in a period of, I suppose, broader political disintegration of the Western Roman Empire. Would that be?
Yes,
like this isn't an isolated incident.
That's fair to say. Yeah.
Yeah, no, there was many invasions going on. Obviously, you've got the Goths trying to stream over the Danube, and many other tribes. What's also interesting, you mentioned the idea of federati there, Nathan. Well, another point to remember with federati, yes, they served in the Roman army or served Roman service, but in exchange, they were given land in the empire. So you're literally inviting the barbarians in and settling them down, which is so you can imagine it's like, you know, you go from manning this wall to defend against barbarians and you're just inviting them in because you can't get enough manpower. So you can see where things start to go into a bit of a downward spiral. Another event in Britain that's worth around this time, adding to the chaos, is, and we briefly mentioned Constantine and his father Constantius, who had been like junior emperors of the West from Britain, and that's how they kind of launched their campaigns, where Constantine eventually unified the empire. Well, there was another attempted usurper emperor called Maximus or Maximius around this time. He actually murders the Western Emperor Gratian and then marches all the way to Italy before he's trapped in Aquila and then killed. So yeah, Britain's becoming so prominent that it's used as a staging point for usurper emperors.
Is it worth mentioning? I don't know if we're at 5th century yet, but I think it's worth just noting too, because talking about the context of also like the Roman withdrawal in 410, and there is an event that happens on the continent just prior to this, because as you guys have said, the sacking of Rome itself in 410 was in large part a reason or the main motivating factor for the Romans to finally call quits in Britannia. But let's not forget there was the Great Crossing of the Rhine in 406. And this was basically when the Vandali, the Alans, the Suevi, and other tribes, I believe in like elements of the Franks, start crossing as well. In December 406, the Rhine freezes over during a very, very, very cold winter, and just cross into Gaul. And even at this point, late in the empire, Gaul is a bit like Britannia. Once it's established and experiences prosperity, actually becomes quite a profitable and stable and prosperous part of the empire. But this mass crossing and then eventually the portioning out of parts of Gaul, for example, like although the Visigoths obviously wind up in Spain eventually, they start out as foederati when they're based in around sort of Septimania, which is modern day Narbonne, and Aquitaine, southwestern France. But this crossing in 406 presents a huge transformation. So in some ways, it starts to sever the actual physical connection between Rome, as in the city, and the province of Italia and Britannia. And then also with the presence of these barbarians, within Roman provincial areas, they require additional manpower to sort of contain this invasion. And then, of course, Rome is sacked then in 410. It's a combination of these two things that eventually sort of lead to the Roman abandonment of Britain. I just thought, because we're obviously touching on this period, it's worth mentioning that just in case we miss it.
Yeah, and it's both the sacking of Rome, but at the same time, Britain is there's a letter appealing for help from Rome because they're getting attacked from Saxons and Irish and northern tribes, and they're not getting the support. Part of this is because
correct, yeah,
the remaining soldiers in Britain are getting drawn into continental conflicts. So Constantine III takes his troops. He makes a bid for the empire and takes his troops from Britain into Gaul, and so that leaves Britain with it quite exposed. They're
defenseless.
Yeah, you've become defenseless, and so in many ways it was a kind of it was a victim of the fact it's on the exterior of the empire, but also because it's settled, it's kind of seen as, okay, we can afford to allow this to be left while we go and sort out the business on the continent. Therefore, it's been harassed, and so in 410 there is this, request for help. It's not met, and that's seen as the kind of end of the Roman administration. I know there's some debate about the extent of like the impact of that immediately, whether it was a catastrophe straight away and cities were abandoned immediately, or whether that's a slower process. But certainly it seems that several villas were abandoned, trades declined, and that parts of of Britain start to be taken over by different groups, incoming groups, and groups within Britain, like the Votadini, expanding their territory now that there's not so much a Roman presence, or official Roman presence, I should say, and those soldiers who are remaining on Hadrian's Wall actually establishing their own kind of petty kingdoms.
Their own entity, yeah.
Yeah, Burdeswold fort, for example, in the northwest of England, that has evidence of wooden halls being built within its vicinity in the 5th century. And so perhaps the commander there, and of course at this point, many of them would have come from the local area rather than being, soldiers from another country. Do they just settle and become effectively running things now that the administration over the top of them is gone? I think that's what you were alluding to, Rupert, earlier on.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I believe there's also some amount of debate on what some of these events, particularly in Britain, actually represent. So there's a bit of revisionism, I know, around the withdrawal and the arrangement that actually represented. So I remember in particular the response that was given by the emperors to, I believe it was the groan of the Britons, that they should, or maybe I'm conflating with something else, basically that the Britons should see to their own defense. That this was actually not necessarily as dramatic as it appears in retrospect. And for one thing, it kind of represented the idea that more so that they just weren't going to give specific manpower, but they were still going to allocate resources that would otherwise be expected. So in particular, so the federati arrangement that often worked out to be, instead of being on the Roman payroll, you would be granted a portion of the taxes, or perhaps a portion of the land in an area. That privilege was essentially extended to the Roman citizens in Britain. And so they would basically be given back they would be allowed to keep the money that would be spent on their defense to, figure it out for themselves.
Sorry, you go, Bede, I'll go after you.
Yeah, just to add something else to the wider context, people may be wondering, well, things seem to be really going wrong around this time. Well, that's partly because when the Emperor Theodosius the Great dies in 395, he leaves his two sons. You have Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. And the problem is Honorius is a child, and so he leaves a general called Stilicho as the regent of the empire. And Stilicho is able to keep things relatively stable for a while, but then unfortunately Honorius,
famous half-vandal.
Half-vandal. Stilicho was the only thing really keeping the Western Empire together, and unfortunately Honorius, in his infinite wisdom, betrays and kills Stilicho, and then that's where things really start going badly wrong. So,
well, it's funny that Honorius, in his infinite wisdom. Oh no! Sorry, I was getting confused. I was thinking of Valentinian. I was going to say, because basically the situation with Honorius and Stilicho is replicated with Flavius Aetius and Valentinian III.
Yes, exactly.
You have a gifted general who can protect the empire, and then you have him conspire to have him killed. It's just like, wow.
I mean, it's with Rome, it's bad enough to happen once, but twice in a century. Exactly,
within half century in the case of these two. But yes.
There's a bit of I know Stilicho is quite a liked figure, but there is also an angle that he, in his position as Magister Militum, he was essentially funneling Roman resources towards the Germanic auxiliaries or the Germanic Federati, as opposed to rebuilding the core Roman army. So it depends on. So you mentioned that he was half Vandal. It kind of depends on whether you think he was more loyal to his Roman half or his Vandal half, because I think it's potentially an open question.
Sorry, just wanted to, before we forget, I just want to tangent on to something that Rupert said earlier about the where were we? You mentioned something quite pertinent just before. I don't want to expand on it. I've just gone blank now. When you first answered Nathan, what were you discussing, Rupert? I'm just trying to. Actually, no.
Federati arrangement and
the Federati. Thank you. Yeah. So when we read the Romans withdrew the legions, the problem is that's unspecific, because in many battles, when you sort of see totals, you'll often see, take for example, like Caesar's victory at Thapsus in North Africa, or the battles between Octavius and Mark Antony and the Liberators and whatever at Philippi and what have you. There'll be X number of legions plus auxiliaries, right? They're actually often counted as a separate entity. And what I have, I mean, if someone else has information I actually like to know, I just haven't come across it. But I actually do wonder if those final 2 garrisoned Roman legions in Britannia were actually, technically and in actuality withdrawn from Britain, but the auxiliary units, along with the foederati, actually stayed back. Because I've never attained an answer to that, because even though it would be less than ideal, if the auxiliary units stayed in Britannia and fought alongside the foederati, it'd actually give Roman Britain a fighting chance. But if the legions plus the auxiliaries are withdrawn, then that presents a much more dire situation for the Roman citizens of Britain, just as a thought exercise.
Well, funny you should mention that, because throughout this I've been bringing up the Saxon shore, and I think that is kind of the missing piece of that puzzle in a sense, because if indeed, and I haven't had concrete information on this either. I mean, it's to my knowledge, it's an academic open question as well, but I might just be not up to date on it. But yeah, if the Saxon shore and a lot of these fortifications were being used as essentially also mercenary encampments for Saxons, then the handing off is basically just the Romans in the Roman state, instead of paying for some of those federati or some of those auxiliaries directly, instead they just delegate the responsibility to the Britons instead, and the Britons sort out their own administration to pay for the Saxons, but fundamentally the Saxons are still there and you can still buy them.
Correct, yeah, good point.
I think this also explains another context. I mentioned the Votadini, and there is an amazing hoard on what was considered their capital, Traprain Law. It's kind of just about 30 miles south of Edinburgh. And this is a hill where they did excavations in the early 20th century, and they found the largest Roman silver hoard outside of the empire. And this contains a lot of it's been cut up, probably because silver, melting it down, turning it into various things would be more valuable in a post-Roman age than having the original things, which are like amazing plates decorated with Hercules and biblical scenes and wine vases and so on, plus lots of coins. And these coins date, several of them, between 410 and 420. So the traditional answer is, they were foederati, but of course with the dates here, to me, I've always thought, well, it's actually the Roman Britons who have given this hoard to the foederati as a way of paying them. And I think what you've just pointed out, Rupert, with look to your own defenses, very much would support that interpretation. And so they're another example of, and they were also paid to go to other parts of Britain. So I know a group of them settled in the north of Wales to defend against Irish tribes. So there was very much this approach, not just with the Saxons, but with other tribes in Britain, moving them around to help protect what remained of the Roman Britain kind of civilization at that point. So I think we've kind of moving towards the end of, well, we've kind of passed the end of Roman Britain proper here, and how the wall kind of exists beyond that point. And I think it's after this point it becomes essentially there's a few forts which remain intact in our living communities, but beyond that it doesn't exist as a major fortification, or isn't used by any group as far as I know, as part who to kind of reinvigorate the land. It's very much left after that point.
Well,
but
one I believe of many theories around King Arthur. I believe that there is one that much of King Arthur's exploits were based out of a former fort of Hadrian's Wall. So in particular, I believe that would be in the northwest, which had more of a Romano-Briton kind of, was more of a Romano-Briton stronghold. As opposed to some of the other areas that were a little bit more perhaps vulnerable to Saxon influence. So yeah, that would potentially be the last bit of significance, perhaps in contrast, as I was saying earlier, to the Limes Germanicus, where the fortifications end up being like an ongoing element of political importance, because Charlemagne eventually sets up his capital there. I believe quite a lot of the Franks end up doing that. But Hadrian's Wall does not seem to have the same significance. Depending on whether you believe that theory around King Arthur, because if that's the case, then the failure of Arthur to have that lasting influence kind of took the center of gravity away from Hadrian's Wall and placed it somewhere else instead. Well, not just somewhere else, more so the Saxon shore. Again, you kind of got this idea perhaps of two different strings of fortifications which are in some kind of in a sense of conflict with one another, perhaps because one of them is Saxon and one of them is Brythonic.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think perhaps actually the part of the challenge that Britain's faced in the Saxons is that they had a pretty secure location on that east coast with those forts. So even if you could drive them back, dislodging them completely would have been a very, very difficult task, especially from the position that they were fighting from.
Once again, some of this is fairly speculative, because it's an open question whether they were consistently garrisoned by Saxons, as one of the theories would suggest, or whether they were more a defense against the Saxons. But one way or another, they get brought in to fight the Picts, and well, that's when they definitely established the Saxon shore as more definitively Saxon.
So in terms, yeah, go ahead, Bede.
Yeah, just another idea. This idea of the legacy of Roman Britain. Well, obviously, I'm quite familiar with Bede, having read the ecclesiastical history. But one of the sources Bede uses for writing that was a British monk called Gildas, who was about in the 6th century, and Gildas wrote this very famous epistle called "On the Ruin of Britain." And it's one of the most blistering things I've ever read, because he's absolutely lambasting the British kings. You're all degenerate and corrupt. You're all fallen from gods. And this is something very much Bede repeats in the ecclesiastical history. There's almost this idea that the Saxons conquered Britain because the British they fell away from, proper Christian faith, so to speak, and that therefore the Saxons were like the chosen people of God. And so, you mentioned earlier in the stream this idea that, with Bede being up in Wearmouth Jarrow, obviously that's up in the northeast, it's very near Hadrian's Wall. It's almost like the shadow of the Roman legacies right there. And, Bede repeating these ideas of Gildas, it's almost like, the Saxons come in, they're Christianized by St. Augustine's mission, and it's almost like the Saxons recreate that old Roman order to some extent after the chaos of that kind of sub-Roman period.
Certainly, I think Gildas is On the Ruin of Britain. It's what everybody should give it a read. As you say, it's a visceral kind of dressing down of the Brythonic kings. And what's kind of interesting in there is we have the kind of early beginnings of the legends of Vortigern, king who invites Hengist and Horsa, the leaders of the Saxons, to defend the Britons and to settle. But this leads to Hengist and Horsa eventually trying to overthrow Vortigern. But then we have this character Ambrosius Aurelianus, who seems to lead the fight back. And there's been suggestion from various historians that, such as Geoffrey Ashe, that that Vortigern represents maybe a sort of Celtic Briton who is rejecting the Roman ways to some extent, whereas a character like Ambrosius Aurelianus is very much of that Roman Briton faction and reasserting it in this crisis, and is able to marshal some defense against the Anglo-Saxons. And then later, Nennius, a Welsh monk writing in I believe, is it the 8th century? He then inserts Arthur into this history and says essentially after Ambrosius Aurelianus, there was an Arthur who marshaled the various tribes of the Britons against the Saxons with the great Battle of Baden, preventing the Saxon advance further. So we can see where those early connections of Arthur with Roman Britain start to emerge is within this sort of narrative that Gildas and Bede and Nennius are telling.
Because also interesting, because around this time, obviously in Ireland, you've got what's known as a Celtic Christianity, this kind of form of Christianity that's a bit detached from Rome. And you've kind of, with Augustine's mission, as I mentioned, you've kind of had this contest to see which brand of Christianity is going to dominate the British Isles. And it's at the Synod of Whitby in the mid-7th century when the kings of Northumbria, they side with Rome when they're going to date Easter. And that's kind of seen as, the kind of doom of Celtic Christianity. So again, you mentioned the Welsh kind of leaning into Legend of Arthur, and then we've got Bede kind of leaning into this sort of legacy of the Roman Catholic Church and the Saxons. It's almost like both are sort of competing to say, we're more like truly honouring like the Roman legacy, and therefore we're more legitimate.
So we've just hit the 2-hour mark, and I think that we should bring this to a close in a few moments. But I have one final, or kind of one question with 2 parts. In the title for this stream, presented Hadrian's Wall as the early castles of Britain, or at least stone castles of Britain. Do you think that it's fair or appropriate to call it castles rather than fortifications? And whether or not you think that, why do you think we don't think of it in that way, as opposed to other fortifications?
Well, it could just be that we associate castles with the medieval period, and obviously Hadrian's Wall predates the medieval period. But when you put it in that context, Nathan, no, I don't really see why we shouldn't see them as the first castles, because they fulfill a very similar role to what castles would later do. So,
I mean, in that respect, when we were outlining the nature of them, there are these. I guess you could see it as a curtain wall with a number of towers and keeps, with gatehouses. There's the ditch, the vallum behind it. So in terms of its structure, it's quite similar, or the components of a medieval castle are there. But then also the function of it as a defensive place, a center point to disseminate power and spread military power and political power, an economic center where there's a life of a place. So I get and towns forming or communities forming, not just within the fortifications but on their exterior. I think there's an argument there. Somebody in the chat, Awesome Lightning, he would disagree with this because he argues that they never had a non-military residency. along Hadrian's Wall. So he would say they're not a castle as a consequence of that.
Well, we think about the etymology of castle. I believe it comes from the Latin castrum, which is the Roman name for a fort. And, so the Romans built castrums all over Britain as part of Hadrian's Wall. And, the governors would use them as seat of operations, as you mentioned, that form part of like the local economy and community. So to me, I see a logical through line between them.
Well, to that exact point, let's not forget or omit the fact that behind Hadrian's Wall are a series of castra which housed the auxiliaries that manned the wall, and for a time even housed the legions which were deployed alongside the wall and were likely responsible for the majority of its construction. So if the very things that dot the wall, which are named castra, from which we attain the etymology of castle via, I suppose, a combination of English and sort of Norman French, well, what technically is, something has to have a genesis to some degree. And the other thing is not to get into the weeds of what's the word I'm looking for? Like, not to get into sort of semantics, right? But a military force can besiege a castle. A military force can also besiege a city, right? I appreciate that castles are their own thing, and within, there are dungeons, there are keeps. There's a whole manner of different descriptors for sort of similar things, a motte with a bailey, and there's all kind of arrangements, right? And from different cultures, the Normans, the Germans, the medieval English, the Byzantines, the Italians. We've all got our own sort of variants of these, let's call them fortifications, And I mean, you've got impressive things such as, Crac de Chevalier in Syria. You've got the Theodosian walls in Constantinople. There's any order of examples that sort of display these massive differences between them, but essentially they serve a similar purpose, not an identical purpose, obviously, but a similar purpose. They are sort of fortified, in the vast majority of instances, stone structures, to defend territory and or defend a force and or a population, either as a frontier fortification or as an internal security structure, or indeed, as, say, for example, was done with Edward the Longshanks in his Welsh campaign, built in opponent territory in order to pacify the countryside and to use as a rallying point and as a deployment for patrols and in order to gain a stranglehold all over the countryside. I'd say, we should not conflate them, because they're not necessarily the same thing, but they largely, and for all intents and purposes, serve similar purposes and do the same thing. They are a force multiplier, they're a defensive structure, they are manned and maintained by military personnel to serve similar purposes. They're just, you might say they're a similar thing that serves slightly different applications of that thing. Not to get into sophistry, but, I don't think we should go being too in the weeds about what's a castle, what's a wall.
I think I'd struggle to give a better answer than that. So
sorry, that was a semi-lucid rant because it's 5 a.m. here, so I apologise to the listeners.
Well, thank you for staying with us so long.
Indeed.
Do it for the cause, gentlemen. Sorry, I'm armed with another coffee, so I'm ready to go.
Well, the only thing I would add then quickly, just to address the previous previous comment about it not being not having much of a non-military role, would be that I think that's more a factor of what we were discussing, or what I've been sort of discussing throughout, is that it seems to have sort of lost out in this general power struggle and sort of lost some of its pride of place after the Roman influence waned, because I contrast it once again against the Limes Germanicus, and I believe it's Aachen that was, or Aachen, which was originally just essentially another node in the wider wall, but grew into a fairly substantial city and the capital of under the Franks at various points, particularly under Charlemagne.
And Trier had a similar standing as well in that sense.
Yeah, many of these,
as did Mainz as well. Old Roman Mogontiacum.
Metz
those
as well,
three, yeah, those 3 or 4 cities sort of formed that backbone of the Rhine frontier by the end of the Western Empire period, for sure.
Yeah, and they essentially just grow out of their entire cities and often palaces that grow out of what was originally just purely a military fort. So yeah, perhaps had Hadrian's Wall sort of maintained its dominance as a center of power projection in the British Isles, then it would have become a whole settlement complex, complete with palaces and cities built around it, sort of as I guess ultimately happened with places like Newcastle, but much earlier and much more enduring.
Well, I would just like to thank all three of you for an absolutely fantastic discussion. I have learned so much about Hadrian's Wall from you fine gentlemen, and
Nathan, may I ask you just one more thing? Because
yes.
when we started, sorry, I hate to interrupt you. I do apologize for my rudeness. The ill-mannered colonial that I am. When we started the stream, I mentioned about this continuity or this sort of lineage between Hadrian's Wall, the Aurelian Wall, and the Theodosian Wall. Do you want to just briefly touch on that, or should we save that for another time?
I think let's save it for another time.
Okay. No, I was gonna. Okay, no, that's good. No, I realized we're coming on 2 hours, so no, just I wanted to give you the opportunity if you wanted to touch on it because it is an important thing. Like, what is the aftermath of something? And I think that could be another discussion altogether because you got to think when we look in the modern day when we think of castles. I mean, England is one of the quintessential places we imagine. Like, it's one of the first things that comes to mind, isn't it? It's not, I mean, obviously Germany has its own tradition of castle building, as does the French, obviously, sort of as a result of the Crusader period. But definitely, there's this sort of idea that medieval feudal England and the idea of castle building are so almost inseparable, to the imagination. For anyone who's like studied history, even in a rudimentary sense, like you started this stream by sort of mentioning like Robin Hood and Richard the Lionheart and whatever. It's so singed in our sort of cultural and civilizational mentality and memory. So yeah, no, I definitely think that as a genesis point, Hadrian's Wall does have influences far beyond itself, both in time and geography.
I think very much so, and you've hinted perhaps at future streams that we will need to have together because yes, there is that kind of soul of England, the romantic or the romance England, which is evoked by castles and Arthur and Robin Hood, as you say, and Rome is a part of that too, as we were indicating earlier. So we will come on to those things. But
thank you, sir.
I just want to thank you, all three of you, for a wonderful stream, and to the audience for joining us. It's been great to have so many of you watching and commenting. We really appreciate that support. And I would just like to ask each of the gentlemen here if they have anything they would want to promote. So let's go clockwise. So Rupert, is there anything you would like to promote, sir?
The Beowulf Foundation, of course. Buy your calendar, buy the magazine.
You mean Pendragon, sir? You mean Pendragon?
Oh, yes, of course. Sorry, the Beowulf Foundation, but also Pendragon. But yeah, it's getting late here as well, I guess.
Yeah.
Apologies. But yes, Pendragon. Other than that, just keep an eye out for future content that we've got coming out. There's a lot, and see what's already out there.
Fantastic. And Bede.
Well, on my channel, I cover various sort of historical topics. The main thing I'm working on at the moment is a series on the history of modern Iran with my good friend Hunger the Dye Merchant. But there's actually 2 other streams. There's one that I've got in the works here with Mr. Pertinax, which we're hoping to do at some point in the near future on the Byzantine stroke Roman general Belisarius, who is a very interesting, fascinating figure. So hopefully we'll get to that at some point before the end of the year. But there's also an older stream on my channel which is pertinent to today's conversation because I saw AI Shiatori in the chat earlier. I did a stream with him on my channel all about early British Christianity, and we were talking about Gildas, about Bede, etc., etc. So if you're interested in that, go and give that a watch because that was a fun stream too.
Thank you. And finally, Furious, is there anything you would like to promote, sir?
Indeed. Whilst I've had the pleasure of streaming with both of these gentlemen in the past, and you'll find our collective work on the Apostolic Majesty channel, I have actually streamed with Bede himself previously. A few different topics there. I think we've canvassed a few things over the years. We've touched on Southwest Africa, Letter von Vorbeck, and also that book by Fuller was amazing. The one about like
it was the Caesar stream. Yes, it was Julius Caesar, Man, Soldier, and Tyrant by JFC Fuller.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was fantastic. And we've done other stuff, and I really do look forward to the one about Belisarius, because Belisarius is for anyone who does have an inkling for East Rome, Belisarius cannot be a hero. He's very much like a last Roman type figure, and the only thing is I do have to obviously re-canvas my books on Belisarius, so I actually want to be better informed for that stream than I was for this one. So yes, you've kind of touched on what we have in the works, and I suppose just to bring to people's attention, we haven't quite penciled in anything just yet, but myself and Mr. Majesty are cooking up a little something. We should start the first stream of, if I could call it, a mini series on Japan. So we're going to start with the Sengoku Jidai at some point and probably end up with the Satsuma Rebellion. We're trying to think with the format. We're probably thinking across 3 or 4 streams, but we're hoping to start before the end of the year. If not, we'll start early next year. We'll have to see how our schedules work. But yes, we got something in the works, so that will be good fun.
That's fantastic.
That sounds wonderful.
Yeah. So everybody,
and thank you, Nathan. I also, just as a final point, the task of Pendragon and what you guys have in mind and your objectives and your goals is very worthwhile. And I think for any of us who have this inkling for historicity and our heritage, I think Pendragon is a fantastic idea and concept, and I'm sure I speak for everyone. We wish you all the best, and if we can help in any way in the future by doing more of these streams or other stuff, count me in. It's good stuff.
Well, that is great to hear, my friend, and we really value your support and everybody who supports us, because really we want to follow that example of a man like John Clayton, who not only loved Hadrian's Ball but saved it so that we could talk about it today, that we could celebrate it and learn something from it. And we want to do that for Britain's castles. So if that's something that inspires you, dear viewer, then you can support us in many ways. You can in a very simple way, just liking and sharing what we're doing is so valuable. It helps to spread what we're doing and help us get more support. You can volunteer with us. You can donate. You can buy a magazine or calendar from our website at pendragon.foundation. And there's going to be plenty more content online, but also in real life events coming in the future. So just watch this space, and anything you can do to help us, we really, really value, because this is such an important thing to preserve our heritage and to see it brought back into our lives. So yes, thank you again to everybody who's taken part and who has watched it, and we wish you a good evening or good morning if you are living in Australia. Good night, gentlemen. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.